today. I've been looking forward to her visit for quite some time now, and I'm so happy that she could make it, and I'm even happier that, you know, she thought that coming to Wisconsin in weather like this was a good choice. I have been working on a project called the Nonviolence Project, where undergraduate students essentially do the research, gather data, and write public-facing articles on issues of civil resistance using nonviolent tactics. One of my students is here at the table, please talk. We have been doing this work over the pandemic. We have had funding from the Center for South Asia and from the History Department. And I am hoping that this project becomes a permanent part of the History Department's work in accordance with the Wisconsin idea. I'm so glad that Professor Mantena is going to be here. Also, I hope that she's going to be the first distinguished speaker in what turns out to be an annual lecture. Professor Karuna Mantena is Professor of Political Science at Columbia University and co-director of the International Conference for the Study of Political Thought, CSPT. She is the author of Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine, and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism, which I remember reading as a graduate student for my prelims. And I was in awe of her, and I'm still in awe of her, seeing her in person before me. She analyzed the transformation of 19th century British imperial ideology in this wonderful book. She has recently published articles on Gandhi's political realism, the nonviolence of Martin Luther King, and the theory and practice of nonviolence in the 20th century. She is currently finishing a book tentatively titled Gandhian Politics of Nonviolence. Without further ado, I hand it over.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Mo. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I've looked at the project, and it's exciting to see overlapping teaching and research interests. And of course, to the center, I had planned this trip because I thought it would be spring. It's almost spring, but so far everything's been wonderful. So, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday. So the title of the talk is Gandhi's Critique of Violence, and I was just going to start with some, just to give you a little sense of my overall perspective. In the talk, I'm going to focus on Hind Swaraj, which is Gandhi's most famous text, and maybe a text that many of you might have read before. But my interest in writing on Gandhi, and it's a book project on Gandhi, is partially to reconstruct Gandhi as a theorist of political action and try to trace the development of the theory and practice of Satyagraha, his name for nonviolent action. I think when people write about the origins of Satyagraha, they often are trying to tease out, which is still an interesting but difficult project, the comparative influence of Tolstoy, Thoreau, Ruskin, the vegetarian movement or the Victorian radical movement, or the Gita and Indian philosophic traditions. And I do that in the work in some ways, but whichever side they emphasize, I think there is still one underlying assumption in almost all Gandhi's studies, which is an assumption of continuity and completeness in Gandhi's ideas. So in some sense, the theory of Satyagraha arrives fully formed either in London in the late 19th century or in South Africa, and it's simply applied on a much larger scale in India. And Gandhi in his late years is just sort of doubling down on some original convictions, some deep convictions about nonviolence. I want to think of it more as Gandhi's experiment with Satyagraha as a long and evolving argument that took shape over the course of 4 decades of intense political activity. With each campaign, especially, there were challenges posed, and especially in arguments with rivals and critics, I think the nuances of the conceptual development would change. Some nuances would recede while others would come to the fore, and newer ideas and tactics would come into play. And I think this was also the case with Gandhi's critique of violence. It emerged in moments of crisis and criticism. In fact, I think a lot of Gandhi's great intellectual discoveries, in his language he called them epiphanies, that were triggered by a practical problem or criticism. For example, the invention of Satyagraha in South Africa, it took place during this debate about transnational immigration, a new restrictive registration regime that Gandhi saw as an existential threat to the Indian community in South Africa. And in response, he sort of instinctively innovated these new forms of action beyond the sphere of liberal politics or legal action, which involved refusing registration and mass jail going. And he invented this practice, and the epiphany was it sort of combined some moral ideas, ethical ideas, with, and it changed his previous political practice, which was more traditionally liberal in form. And then the practice emerged, and then in the next 2 years, he gave it a name, Satyagraha, and started developing a philosophy. So there's also a way in which Gandhi, the practice or the critical practice, sometimes prefigures the thinking and the philosophic commitment. And I think with violence, there's something similar. Hind Swaraj is also written as an epiphany. He's confronted by militant violence for the first time. So also, I think conceptually, he has a theory of satyagraha, of practice, before he has a critique of violence, and before he has a theory of nonviolence as well. So Hind Swaraj emerges, he's confronted by militant violence, and it's the first time that Gandhi actually has to write a critique of violence. And he does so, the epiphany is by connecting that to a critique of civilization, which Hind Swaraj, again, is the first text that he writes, a critique of civilization. And the other moment I'm going to mention at the end, so I'm going to focus on Hind Swaraj, and then the other two moments where I think the critique of violence really takes shape is the beginning, really the early 20s, the mass movement, the beginning of the mass satyagraha in India, in the Rowlatt Satyagraha, and of course non-cooperation, both of which are punctuated by an end in violence. And I think that period, the 20s, is in my mind the most important period for the crisis, discovery, refinement of satyagraha. So in the talk, I'm going to try to sort of give a sense of what Gandhi's understanding of the problem of violence was, some of these shifts over time, some of the nuances, and then in the final section, I'll try to say a little bit about the adjustments Gandhi made to the theory and practice of satyagraha to respond to what I think, in his view, is a diverse sources of violence in politics. Okay, so for Gandhi, political life was, in a profound and deep sense, closely bound to the problem of violence. Very broadly, he held to a metaphysical account of the world that accepted himsa, or violence, to be an ever-present and unavoidable fact of human existence. The world, he noted, was, quote, bound in a chain of destruction. The basic mechanisms for the reproduction of biological and social life necessarily involved continuous injury to living matter. But modern civilization posed the problem of violence in new and insistent terms. Gandhi famously declared the modern state to represent, quote, violence in a concentrated and organized form. It was, quote, a soulless machine that, like industrial capitalism, was premised upon and generated coercive forms of centralization and hierarchy. These institutions enforced obedience through the threat of violence. They forced people to labor unequally. They oriented desires towards competitive material pursuits. Civilization rendered persons increasingly passive and servile. In impinging upon moral personality, modern life degraded and deformed it. This was, I think, in Gandhi's view, the basic structural violence of modernity, a violence that threatened bodily integrity, but also human dignity, individuality, and autonomy. In this respect, I think eventually Gandhi's deepest objection to violence was closely tied to a worldview that took violence to adhere in modern modes of politics and modern ways of living. This critical stance towards modern civilization was pervasive and long-standing. I think it fundamentally shaped Gandhi's basic moral commitments and the horizon of his politics. But alongside this broad ethical, moral, structural critique of violence, Gandhi would also develop a distinctly political argument, one that turned on exposing the futility of violence. These lines of overlapping criticism came together forcefully in what has remained Gandhi's most famous political tract, Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, published in 1909. Hind Swaraj emerged out of a confrontation with militant nationalism, and its purpose was, in part, to undercut the growing attraction of terrorist tactics within Indian political circles. To adopt such methods was to embark upon, in Gandhi's words, a suicidal policy. Gandhi provocatively linked the appeal of these modern methods of violence with a misplaced desire to emulate modern civilization, famously ridiculing the nationalist understanding of independence as simply a demand for a, quote, English rule without the Englishman. In contending that a mistaken conception of Swaraj was implicated in the very means of militant nationalism, Gandhi called attention to the strategic futility of political violence. To advocate for violence was to favor political means that oriented nationalism towards the wrong political ends, namely an elitist or statist vision of Swaraj. The route to violence was also suicidal in a further sense. It was a political tactic fraught with definite dangers and adverse consequences. In Hind Swaraj, Gandhi began to make a more explicit case for the tactical superiority of nonviolence, that Satyagraha would prove more successful than violent methods in contesting injustice and securing political reform. He argued broadly that provocative or violent tactics would intensify dynamics of confrontation and retaliation by unleashing negative passions and dispositions that thwarted political progress. These contentions about the futility of violence were closely tied to an idea that was fundamental to Gandhian thinking, that a deep reciprocity existed between means and ends, such that political ends, in this case freedom or Swaraj, would be compromised or rendered precarious when pursued through improper means. So in this talk, I'm going to disentangle in some sense those three layers of Gandhi's critique of violence: a moral critique tied to the critique of the violence of modern civilization, a strategic critique that links advocacy of violence with particular forms of Swaraj or elitist or statist versions, and a third tactical criticism focused on the effects of violence in escalating political conflict. And the latter two, the strategic and tactical, is what I think together highlight the futility of violence and lay the basis for what I think is an often overlooked but distinctly political critique of violence. Interpreters tend to give priority to one of these elements over others, so strict Gandhians and moral philosophers tend to see nonviolence as a creed or way of life, and in that privilege the moral or ethical argument against violence, whereas activists, especially contemporary activists, tend to highlight the purely strategic elements, so you can think of Gene Sharp and the school of strategic violence. Gandhi himself, I think, argued for greater integrity. Nonviolence was, and this is a phrase that King uses too, nonviolence was both morally and practically superior to alternatives. I think part of the problem with the contemporary debate is it assumes a sharp divide between moral and political critique and moral and political nonviolence, between, in their language, between principled and strategic nonviolence. And I think there are a lot of problems with that division, but I think one of it is a very narrow conception of a moral practice. So I think what Gandhi had in mind, and when I use moral, it's not just a moral objection to violence, but ideas of moral integrity, self-discipline, practices of self-mastery. These were all crucial to Gandhian politics, not just as ethical ideas or ethical ideals. For Gandhi, the integrity of action was part and parcel of its political efficacy. So the self-disciplining of action, the inward work of Satyagraha, is linked to specific outward effects. And I'll try to come back to that point at the end of the talk, when I talk about how the change in critique of violence changes the practice of Satyagraha. Okay, so I'm going to give a kind of more, hopefully do a short version of some of the key arguments of Hind Swaraj and sort of highlight the futility arguments that I think sometimes are lost in the arguments about civilization. So as I said, Hind Swaraj was written in 1909 on a trip back from London. The event that catalyzed the book was the assassination of William Curzon Wiley, who was the aide-de-camp to then Secretary of State for India, John Morley. The assassination was undertaken by Madan Lal Dhingra, a young Indian student with close ties to militant nationalist groups that had coalesced around India House and radicals such as Shyamji Krishnavarma and Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Dhingra was Savarkar's protege. In South Africa, Hind Swaraj is written while Gandhi is actually in South Africa. It's on a trip to London when the Union of South Africa is being debated and constituted. And so at the time that he's in London, he had begun this experiment in Satyagraha, and he was extremely confident about that experiment. But Dhingra's act and the approval that it received amongst Indian nationalists forced Gandhi to articulate a sharper statement of Satyagraha's viability, of why Satyagraha ought to be the preferred method for progressive Indian politics. And I think this was what required a more direct critique of political violence, which would turn heavily on the critique of modern civilization. So again, Gandhi's argument was structured around the idea that the appeal of modern methods of violence was tied to a misplaced desire to emulate modern civilization. Hind Swaraj is staged as a dialogue between a Gandhi-like figure, the editor, and a reader who's sympathetic to the actions of a Hindu militant nationalist youth like Dhingra. The reader is impatient for Swaraj and especially wary of traditional modes of petitioning the crown and parliament for political concessions, and therefore argues for more radical, violent forms of resistance to British rule. Gandhi's strategy was to position himself on the side of the militants in their unhappiness with petitioning and the deference to legalistic channels of protest, but to also show them that the nationalism they espoused, the nationalism of a Western educated elite, was overly enamored of the achievements of modern civilization. So the first half of the book has these two famous rhetorical peaks. Chapter 4, Gandhi as editor asks the reader why he is so determined to expel the English from India by force if he still wanted India to retain English political, legal, and economic institutions. Here, Gandhi famously charges the reader for wanting English rule without the Englishman. Quote, "You want the tiger's nature, but not the tiger." That is to say, you want to make India English, and when it becomes English, it will not be called Hindustan, but Englistan. This is not the Swaraj that I want. Gandhi's first salvo was to frontally attack England's hallowed political institutions as unworthy of imitation. They were imbricated with a civilization that was every day degrading and debasing moral life. Modern civilization was a civilization that, quote, "made bodily welfare the object of life." Underlying this harsh portrait of materialism and its spiritual malaise was a worry that the true damage of civilization was a loss of moral integrity. Indians under the thrall of civilization had lost their sense of self, had lost control of mind in the pursuit of luxury. Their minds were agitated, restless, unsatisfied. Indians were living outside of themselves, especially because their cultural priorities were no longer their own and impossible to renew. That's a very long argument. I'm just going through it quickly to get to the more political sides of it. The crucial part, I think, is that sense of the loss of self, the loss of moral integrity, Gandhi argued was the true cause of Indian enslavement. So this is the second argumentative or rhetorical peak of the book so far. Chapter 7, with Gandhi's contention that, quote, "the English we have given it to them. They are not in India because of their strength, but because we keep them." Gandhi was here directly contesting the militants' focus on English military supremacy as the direct cause of colonial oppression. For Gandhi, something deeper, more internal, more psychological, and epistemic was at stake. The entire problem of colonialism was redefined not as alien rule nor external oppression, but as the loss of self-rule, or more pointedly, the predicament of self-enslavement. So both the British and the militant response mirrored each other in their mutual commitment to the power of brute force to create and sustain political orders. This might, I think, in fact, be the most damaging moral and psychological consequence of colonialism, the ways in which the oppressed come to accept the legitimacy of force or domination as a political principle. So the idea that England ought to be ousted from India with a more resolute show of force was not therefore the solution, but itself a sign of Indian self-enslavement. Now, 2/3 of the way through the book, Gandhi seems to have concluded the main argument. He's concluded his critique of English institutions. He's discussed what the effects of civilization have so far been in India, how India has been ground down by it. He showed how all the so-called gifts of British rule in modern civilization, from railways, modern medicine, to lawyers and representative government, were so many signs of civilizational corruption. They were, in his terms, merely emblems of slavery. But in chapter 13, Gandhi defines true civilization as a steady, sustained balance in which the path of duty and conduct or way of life are clear. True civilization is one in which we know ourselves, our minds are no longer restless and unsatisfied. The reader seems persuaded, or at least receptive, to Gandhi's assault on modern civilization and the argument for reframing Swaraj for India in a new idiom. And yet the reader restates his original position, that the violent expulsion of the British may still be necessary. That is, even though he accepts Gandhi's radical revision of Swaraj, he nevertheless suggests that Dhingra and the militants may yet be right, that violence is a useful tool for enacting it. The reader asks, quote, "Why should we not obtain our goal, which is good, by any means whatsoever, even by using violence?" But in reposing the question, I think Gandhi has, as it were, decided that he needs to answer the charge differently and more directly on the plane of practical politics. So the question at stake was, I think, fundamental. It was posed differently. It's what can be obtained by force and violence in politics. The problem of violence involves not only accepting its legitimacy, which was tied to the question of civilization, but also its efficacy. So for Gandhi, I think ultimately to break the hold of the worship of force, to really question its legitimacy, one had to also radically undo belief in its immediate efficacy. In other words, the moral foundations of violence are premised on a prior presumption, quote, that we can get men to do things by force and therefore we use force. The critique of violence, I think, must call into question this basic presupposition. And I think that's the problem and question at the center of one of Hind Swaraj's, I think it is actually Hind Swaraj's longest chapter, entitled Brute Force. It's a dense chapter replete with metaphors that are meant to illustrate the necessary connection between the means and ends of Swaraj. The most well-known metaphor introduced in that chapter describes the relationship between means and ends as an organic one. Trying to achieve Swaraj through violence was like trying to grow, quote, a rose through planting a noxious weed. For, quote, the means may be likened to a seed, the end to a tree, and there's just the same inviolable connection between the means and the ends as there is between the seed and the tree. We reap exactly as we sow. This is exemplary, I think, of a strategic argument that violence would cultivate the wrong kind of independence, bring into being the wrong kind of polity. Again, I think namely elitist and statist forms of Swaraj. In institutional terms, the enthrallment to the ideology of force was demonstrated in the nationalist, I think for Gandhi, demonstrated in the nationalist commitment to maintaining the basic features of the centralized modern state. That would be retaining, quote, the tiger's nature. And what the tiger's nature was the rule of violence, the modern state as the embodiment of violence. I think Gandhi also discerned in the desire for English rule without the Englishman an elitist claim to power, and I want to emphasize it because I think it's not often noted. The Western educated elite desired the expulsion of the English to rule in their stead. This would only result in for Gandhi would only result in a facade of independence. It would amount to nothing more than, quote, a mere change of personnel. More provocatively, Gandhi worried that for most of India, this transition would feel, quote, like a change of masters only. So this, I think, is the populist or anti-elitist character of these arguments. There is a chapter in Hind Swaraj on Italian independence that begins to bring this out, in which Gandhi distinguishes between independence understood as the removal of foreign rule. In the Italian example, freedom from the Austrian yoke, which he construed as Garibaldi's more diminished aim, versus Mazzini, goal of self-rule, which he defined as self-rule for the whole of the Italian people, that is, its agriculturalists. So the lesson for India was clear: the true patriot must focus on driving out the English. The true patriots must not focus on driving out the English, nor on gaining power for themselves, but on, quote, how the millions can obtain self-rule. The English educated elites must learn to think and act in terms of the majority of ordinary Indians. I think we should remember Hind Swaraj was structured initially as a form of radical self-critique. It's written in Gujarati. It's a self-accusation of the educated elite. The dialogues between two figures of this elite coming to the disquieting conclusion that it was their social class that had been the most corrupted and enslaved by colonialism. The common people, the peasants, the agriculturalists, those who live in the rural interior, in Gandhi's view, had never really been subdued by the British sword or their civilization. Quote, the common people lived independently, enjoyed true home rule. The English do not rule over them, nor will you ever rule over them. So for Gandhi, the elitism of nationalism rendered it an insufficient or incomplete conception of Swaraj. I think the key strategic claim was that elitism was implicated in the means of militant nationalism. This is also an early period. The militants, this was before the Bolshevik Revolution, so the militant idea of action was either anarchist or it was a kind of more propaganda of the deed, individual acts by secret societies. And so Gandhi would say political violence in the form of secret societies and the method of secret murder was a mode of political action only open to the few, privileged, entailed a conspiratorial structure of action. He said in Hind Swaraj, a tactic of assassination could never free the whole of India. It aimed at igniting patriotic fervor and hostility, but it offered little in terms of a model or method for attaining Swaraj, quote, in terms of the masses. For Gandhi, a truly effective form of large-scale resistance had to be an open and popular vehicle by which everyone could individually experience and demand self-rule. Now, turning to the last, so that's the strategic argument. Turning to the tactical arguments, if the strategic claim was that the choice of wrong means would lead to the wrong kind of Swaraj, the tactical claim suggests that violence would undermine the very possibility of Swaraj coming into being. It's an argument that foregrounds the self-defeating character of violence. In the chapter on brute force, the tactical critique, I think, is expressed in the central parable in that chapter, which is the parable of the thief. The reader suggests that we should use any means whatsoever to get rid of a thief who's entered your house. Gandhi's response is that it is not any means, but effective means, and these will have to vary not only in relation to the end one desires, that would be the strategic question, but also will depend on your opponent, your relationship to them, and the instruments and methods they mobilize. Quote, if it is my father who has come to steal, I shall use one kind of means. If it is an acquaintance, I shall use another. And in the case of a perfect stranger, I shall use a third. Between the father and the armed man, each provides a different template of confrontation and notably arouses different reactions and passions. Confronting a father would be disappointing, unnerving. It would make one, quote, weep with pity. But the armed stranger would instantly become my enemy. The sheer strength would rouse in me anger. So the scenario that Gandhi plays out is of the thief as the armed stranger. Quote, so when the, quote, well-armed man steals your property, you are filled with anger. So the beginning is a kind of Buddhist parable about the psychology of anger and revenge. You want to take revenge upon the robber, but you project that urge as one of seeking justice. You, quote, argue that you want to punish that rogue not for your own sake, but for the good of your neighbors. You organize an armed band to counterattack his property. The thief is in turn incensed and responds defiantly. He gathers his forces and, quote, pesters your neighbors who complain that the robber has only resorted to open threats against them after you declared hostilities against him. You feel badly that you have exacerbated the situation, but you feel trapped, knowing you will be, quote, disgraced if you now leave the robber alone. You instead offer to arm and protect them with your funds. Quote, and so the battle grows. The result of wanting to take revenge upon the robber is that you have disturbed the peace. You are in perpetual fear of being robbed and assaulted. Your courage has given place to cowardice. So I think there are two important lessons, at least, conveyed in the parable. The more overt lesson is that improper means chosen to respond to injustice can lead to unintended, deleterious, and unmasterable consequences. More violence, more injustice, more instability. The use of force doesn't mitigate, but rather excites the resentment and hostility of opponents. Secondly, Gandhi portrays, and it's linked, portrays the turn to violence as intimately bound with moral, psychological needs and investments. So the thief's arms rouses anger, the desire for revenge, which initiates the choice of violence. But it's not justified as personal revenge. You give it you claim that the structure is a slightly impersonal claim of justice. Violence needs continuing justification, especially as consequences become negative. The investment in and the motivation for seeking justice and redress is imbricated in the agent's sense of self, such that this investment, this egoism, becomes a vehicle for escalation. These are some of the tactical and strategic arguments I think one can see intimated in Hind Swaraj, but they become more crucial, I think, as Gandhi's practice and thought develops. And in my mind, they are some of the most, especially the tactical arguments, I think to be the most innovative and crucial features of Gandhi's thought and action. And they would be reconfigured and deepened as Satyagraha is continually tested, experimented and contested in practice. Both in the critique of civilization and this tactical critique of the futility of violence, Gandhi highlights what I think are a really important feature of traditional theory of nonviolence, which is psychological instabilities, unmatched desires for control and comfort that elicit impatience, anxiety, frustrations, and these are the explanatory or causal factors that tempt one in the direction of violence. When Gandhi returns to India and begins the mass movements, mass mobilizations against British rule, these psychological elements again come to the fore in new forms of violence that Gandhi diagnosis. So his first two campaigns, the Rowlatt Satyagraha against the extension of wartime emergency powers in 1919, and the non-cooperation movement that built along a series of grievances from the Rowlatt Satyagraha onward. Even though even though NCO is of course one of the most famous campaigns, of course it's good to remember they both ended in a kind of violence, and it was a violence not by militants but people within the movement, acts of violence and intimidation by activists. So the Rowlatt Satyagraha was rioting and property damage, train derailments, and of course NCO ended very infamously with the arson murder of 27 policemen at Chari Chara. In these cases, Gandhi had to reckon with the fact that even ostensibly nonviolent action could somehow easily become implicated or turn or had these tendencies towards violence and coercion. So the very fact of mass action seemed to unleash passions and dispositions that allowed Satyagraha to spill over into acts of intimidation and violence. This kind of violence, the violence of action, was not simply derivative of the structural aspects of violence associated with modern civilization, nor, I think, could it be entirely or simply an elite pathology, although I think sometimes Gandhi still explained it in those terms. It could have been elite pathology simply in terms of a desire to emulate modern civilization or modern modes of politics. There was something else, and I think here the experience of the end of non-cooperation, I'll just call it NCO, I think for Gandhi sharply demonstrated that there were inner tendencies towards violence in mass action that needed to be understood, accounted for, and corrected. So this is the broader new forms of violence that Gandhi had to wrestle with in what I think is his most creative decade. I'm thinking on Satyagraha from Rowlatt to the Salt March, and in a way the Salt March is the culmination of the end of this period of rethinking, of refinement. Some of the, I'm not going to, the talk is really focused on Hind Swaraj to just sort of link them, I'm going to just summarize some of the problems around mass violence or mass violence and mass action, and some of Gandhi's explanations, and then I'll get to how he tried to correct or respond to it. So I think I've already mentioned some of the basic structure. He thought some people just always constantly believed that Satyagraha was a form in which you could mix violence and nonviolence, and the best way to act would be a kind of formula in which you organize kind of purposeful provocation. So this would be his understanding of what went wrong in Chari Chara, that people thought you can kind of take, nonviolence was just another way of using force. And Gandhi really tried to say that was misunderstanding the logic of Satyagraha. It was mixing tactics that actually had opposite psychological tendencies, effects. One was about moderating escalation, and the other was about provoking confrontation and escalation. The other, I think, more generally, was a concern about the uncertainty and unmasterability of action. And here I think Gandhi had a theory of unmasterability built on a theory of karma, loosely analogy. I'll say that word better. But it was akin, I think, to Weber's idea of unintended consequences, Arendt on the frustrations of action. And the idea was that the unmasterability of action leads to frustrations and attempts at mastery through violence, the need to show power and commitment, and a confusion about consequences. And finally, I think that connects back to the general interest in the moral psychology. On the one hand, the temptation towards violence or demonstrating power comes from frustration, but also in the case of Chari Chara, Gandhi would say, comes from also a kind of enthusiasm or sense of collective power. So Gandhi's diagnosis at Chari Chara is also that Indians were learning to overcome fear and overcome slavery, but they were immediately becoming masters, or reveling in this newfound collective power. And that was what drove some of the intimidation, the attempt to intimidate others that were seen as weaker. In the case of Chari Chara, weaker in number. So Gandhi discovered these different forms of violence, these different psychological dispositions in acting, and he thought, I think what makes, again, the 20s interesting is, and generally Gandhi's theory of Satyagraha, instead of churning towards withdrawal, he really tries to rethink and recalibrate ways in which you could still do mass Satyagraha and tried to incorporate more mechanisms of discipline and restraint within the forms of satyagraha. So I think in general, so I'll just say a few general principles and then some examples. So satyagraha as a form of politics was to constrain and discipline these psychological temptations, which in turn would undercut the logic of escalation, polarization, coercion. The key mechanism or term I think that Gandhi uses for this self-limitation is tapasya, or disciplined suffering. And ultimately in moderating or disciplining passions, the discipline would also serve to mitigate the adversary's resentments and resistance. So there's both internal and external consequences. And I think the key was it was something that had to be built into the very structure of nonviolent protest. So in some ways, what nonviolent protest does is it stages practices of self-mastery. It's staged in mass protest, and some of the purpose is the dramatization and display of self-restraint is a part of what nonviolent protest is showing. So after the first major disturbances that accompanied the Rowlatt Satyagraha, that was when Gandhi first started insisting on the idea of adding the term civility, or insisting on the idea of civility of disobedience. And in doing so, Gandhi gave a wholly new resonance to the meaning of civil disobedience. As you may know, the original title to Thoreau's famous essay was Resistance to Civil Government, and the civil was in reference to the state or government, the object of disobedience. So civil disobedience was a shorthand meaning resistance to civil government, and not really about the character of the disobedience. Thoreau was, as you know, defended a broad spectrum of resistance, both nonviolent and violent. And Gandhi now was emphasizing civility, contrasting civil with uncivil or criminal disobedience. Civility would distinguish the actions of the satyagrahi from the anarchists who denied the legitimacy of law as such, and from the criminal who defied the law when it was in their self-interest to do so. By performing disruption in a civil manner, the satyagrahis would emerge, in Gandhi's terms, as pure constitutionalists. In so doing, they immediately undermined the government's attempts to dismiss them as anarchists. So, but of course, I think the really interesting question is, how does one perform or dramatize civility? How do you convey to your opponents, your potential allies, or the public at large that you are not a criminal or an anarchist or a simple disturber of the public political order? And I think this is generally the emphasis on comportment, self-restraint, self-presentation, but I think there are specific rules and forms. So one, for example, that was common in the early all of the satyagrahas, but also in King's campaign in Birmingham, satyagrahis had to take a public vow to follow nonviolence in thought and behavior. And I think taking a vow was also a practice and display of self-rule. It showed you were capable of following your own rule, that you were a lawmaker and not a lawbreaker. It also showed sort of capacity of self-organization. Of course, this was just disobedience. So in the act of disobedience, you show restraint by your willingness to risk punishment and that you're willing to accept the burdens of protest. And in this way, action is made to appear as much as possible like a non-egoistic or non-interested act. In response to Chauri Chaura, I think there are many things that because Chauri Chaura is an act of collective power and collective violence in some ways. And I think in response to it, Gandhi is interested in rituals of individuation within mass protests, and I think that can happen in a number of ways, slowing down the time, making any mass act not look like a simple aggregation or a kind of not like a mob, so anything, and so it would be trying to show the individuals within it. One, I think just, it's not direct, I think one of the things that comes out of Chauri Chaura is Gandhi's real emphasis on the constructive program, the constructive program especially around Khadi. There are a number of ways in which he just doubled down on Khadi, and he's interested in Khadi politically, economically. He argues for it being an important, having a universal quality, identifying rich and poor, undoing privilege, keeping the problem of the rural majority, so linked to a kind of non-elitist Swaraj, an equalizing practice, high and low, rich and poor, etc. But I think it was also, I think it was also a certain kind of practice and display of discipline. So the daily practice of work, like spinning, was about protecting oneself against the impatience, anger, disappointment that's inevitable in politics, in politics of mobilization. So, so I think So Gandhi, of course, in his lifetime, developed a number of rules, rules and forms of, when pickets, boycotts, hartals are nonviolent. And I think these are important because I think in some ways the key to understanding Satyagraha is that it is a form. It's very interested in form and formality of protest, especially the discipline and organization of it. And he took great pains to establish the precise conditions in which nonviolent tactics could be deployed without inducing escalation or enacting coercion. So all pickets, boycotts, and hartals were supposed to avoid the appearance of coercion and intimidation. In the case of pickets, you don't physically stop picket crossers. Ideally, pickets should be silent with no attempt at verbal or physical intimidation. In the case of the hartal or the day-long work stoppage, which is one of my favorite examples because they're so common in Indian politics, but not followed this way. He said they should be announced well in advance, and activists were not allowed to pursue compliance on the day itself. So, and he would say a total hartal with 100% compliance would imply coercion. So Gandhi would insist that the best demonstration, quote, of the voluntary character of the hartal and a matter of pride from the Satyagraha standpoint would be if some shops stayed open. Sometimes he'd say 20% shops stayed open. Indeed, the true Satyagrahi would go further and protect the shops that chose not to comply from harassment, and that would dramatize the voluntary nature of the protest as well as restraint in not intimidating dissenters. And in that way, the movement demonstrated strength and confidence in the justness of their cause. Tactically, by showing civility towards dissenters, it leaves open the door for their potential conversion, and more generally draws more public sympathy, Gandhi thought, than coerced compliance. So in general, the more provocative the tactic, the more exacting the rules were. The larger the crowd, the more silently and slowly it moved. And I think so I'll just end on two notes where I think people, I think when you read those rules, they often think that they're sophistic in some ways. They're just that Gandhi seems to be moving these authorities, giving these sort of these definitions on what counts as nonviolence. But I think in some ways the more interesting way to read these rules and distinctions is not about providing universal moral criteria about what makes an act more just or legitimate, but that they were political maxims. They were tactical and strategic. They were maxims about the message, how the message you communicate through protest, how that message can be heard, and ultimately its capacity to move, disrupt, or persuade the public. And the forms and rules of nonviolence internally were, again, to help mitigate the moral psychology of anger and frustration, a way to manage the uncertainties of action. Said, unlike violence, which might take you down a road of escalation, that's the thief example, nonviolence, because it takes the burdens on itself, can be it can be correcting. It allows for self-correction. That's the language you would use. Externally, these forms and rules were meant to pierce the heart, not just, and in Gandhi's terms, you have to get to the mind through the heart. So you pierce the heart, not directly the mind, and you unsettle long-held prejudices and political opinions. You demonstrate conviction not through conventional reasoning, but through these forms of self-effacing action. Acts, displays of self-constraint can disrupt public expectations and allow one to see the message and the protesters in a new way. And I think that's why rules, to me, are also, that's the last point I'll end on, rules reconcile what often appears to be nonviolence as exacting ethical demands with Gandhi's equally strong insistence that he repeated this often, nonviolence does not require, quote, saints for its working. So rather than thinking of discipline as a prior condition of action or a set of virtues cultivated outside or before, if we think about the forms or formality, then I think we can conceive of nonviolent discipline or self-mastery as dramatized and cultivated in and through the specific forms. So Gandhi's expectation and demand was not that everyone had to be pure in motive in order to act or had to adopt nonviolence as a creed and way of life as he had, but that as he said, but the important thing was that people, quote, consistently carry out the rules of nonviolent action.